Davis.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I give the government two sets of thanks? Firstly, an unreserved set of thanks that I don't have to talk about VAT on caravans this year. But rather more seriously, an unreserved thanks for the action on Equitable Life pensioners, which is morally right, a little overdue, but morally right and exactly the proper thing to do. Now, with respect to the economic strategy of the government, a number of people so far have spoken and pointed out the difficult circumstances of this budget from a number of different points of view. Clearly the government has a difficult deal to handle over the inheritance from the previous government, obviously the borrowing, but not just the borrowing. The level of structural deficit passed on by the previous government was much bigger than I think anybody understood at the time. And that's just economist techno-speak for a society which has too much welfare dependency right through it, including even the middle classes, and too much inefficient delivery of public service, costly and expensive delivery of public service, properly needed public service, but badly delivered. But the second part, which is extremely important and has been alluded to very slightly by a few members who've spoken so far, is the international backdrop that the government has to deal with. We are in a circumstance where world growth is probably about 6%, but that divides sharply into two sectors. The Far East, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, Vietnam, Indonesia and so on, have got growth rates approaching 10% or thereabouts. The developed world, of which we're obviously a part, the growth rate on average is nearer to 1%. So we are in a 1% world, and the reason for that is pretty straightforward. It's the dramatic change in competitiveness between ourselves and the Far East and other developing countries. Now, this doesn't mean it's inescapable, but it means that competitiveness actually has to be at the centre of the strategy we undertake. Competitiveness, pure and simple. Everything else, all the other macroeconomic tricks, frankly, don't work. And I'm addressing the comments of the member for East Antrim who just spoke. He talked very much like, if I may say so, he's not meant to be rude, like a sort of classical Labour member. He talked about stimulus. He talked about, I said I didn't mean to be rude. He talked about this budget as being a balanced budget. It's about 100 and odd billion off being a balanced budget. I mean, there's a vast amount of deficit finance in there. But the point I want to make to him is this. If we look at the historic examples of countries that have been knocked off their historic growth rates, 3 or 4% down to something lower, if we look at what's been done with them, there are very clear examples of success and failure. Let me tell him just for a second about the biggest failure in modern times, which was Japan some 20 years or so ago, which went from a 4% growth rate, pretty much for all the post-war years, to a 1% growth rate after a financial crisis not unlike our own. What did they try? They tried Keynesian expansion. They now have pretty much the biggest public debts in the world. Their annual deficit 10% of GDP in recent years. Did it work? No, it didn't. They also tried monetary activism, and I hope the Treasury bench listens to this, because they had effectively zero interest rates for a decade. Did it work? No, it didn't. They also went in for infrastructure spending, the fashionable item this week. Infrastructure spending on a grand scale. They, in 1 year, spent 40% of their government budget on infrastructure investment. More than was spent to build the entire Panama Canal in 1 year. Did it work? No, it didn't. I'm afraid those macroeconomic policies that people love, because the arithmetic seems to work, are a dangerous allure. We must focus first and last on competitiveness, because without that we will not be able to earn our way in the world. I give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend, and he's of course saying something that should actually be blindingly obvious, because when a government borrows some money and spends it, once it's spent, it's gone. It doesn't create economic growth, and once it's spent that money, it might have a little bit of effect in the economy, but then it's over. And what we need to generate is what Ed Balls used to call endogenous growth. because that's what comes from within the economy itself instead of being stimulated by government spending.
Well, my honourable friend is right. I shan't give him the response to Ed Balls' endogenous growth that Michael Heseltine gave at one party conference. You may remember it. But the simple truth is, this is a blind... It's not Brown, exactly. This is a blinding glimpse of the obvious in many respects. But this is not impossible to put right. Other countries manage to get back to a 3% growth rate or thereabouts, so it can be done. Of course, I'll give way, since I did mention it. Remember, if he's...
I appreciate that. The member seems to be indicating that anyone who talks about putting money into the infrastructure in the economy as a Keynesian. Would you not accept that actually the monetarist argument is that the supply side of the economy is very important, and to stimulate the supply side of the economy, very often the government needs to spend money on capital injections so that you can increase the capacity of the economy to produce more goods. Yeah. So it's not a Keynesian view, it's a monetarist view, which I thought he would identify with.
I'll come back to the detail of the issue in a minute. But the point I'm making to him, and it's a serious point, is that you can do what Keynes said and dig a hole, pay somebody to dig a hole, and then pay somebody else to fill the hole in, and that creates employment. So long as you avoid that and talk about the real value, then we're on the same side. But I'll come back to the real value issue in a moment. Now, of course, the problem with competitiveness, actions to promote competitiveness, is that they're not always politically popular. Indeed, very often they're politically very unpopular. But I will elaborate that in a second. The other element about growth, and everybody agrees in the Chamber today that growth is necessary, of course, is it's also important to the deficit reduction policy. In effect, if you take 1% off the growth rate, the OBR's rule of thumb tells you that within a year or so, that adds £10 billion to the deficit every year thereafter. Every year thereafter. Not once, every year thereafter. So growth is fundamental, indeed, to the central fiscal policy as well. And while we're talking about growth, we've had lots of talk about multiple dip recession, double dip and triple dip recession. In my view, frankly, when we come to look back at these numbers in 5 or 10 years' time and the adjustments that we made, judging by the employment numbers, we haven't actually had real recessions. We've had bouncing around 0 to 1% growth, and that will show up when they correct the numbers, as they will do in a few years. Now, there are 6 key elements to ensuring the competitiveness of the economy, and they're all pretty straightforward. And some of them I agree with what the government's doing, and others I think they have to go further. The first one, straightforward. The Chancellor is absolutely right. He cannot hesitate or flinch in the deficit reduction programme. That's an absolute essential. All of the previous successful examples, Japan is an unsuccessful example, Canada, Germany, Sweden, have all managed their deficit reduction and unflinchingly done so, and it's delivered in all of them 3+% growth rates within a few years. Canada became the fastest growing country in the G8 when it carried it through. And the simple fact is, even with the deficit reduction programme, we will be 600 billion more in debt at the end of this Parliament than we were at the beginning. And that is a devil of a burden for any country to carry. So clearly we cannot hesitate on that. The second is the area where perhaps I and the Treasury bench may have a difference of view. One of the critical issues which drives competitiveness is tax policy. You know, and I wholeheartedly welcome the actions today on corporation tax. I'd like it to go further. And on national insurance, I'd like it to go further. But the simple truth is, expensive, complex, high levels of tax returns are very damaging to a country's economic capability, its competitive capability. And what we should be doing is looking hard at those tax categories that are most responsive to lower rates. We've been talking today, I mean, we've had it today with a couple of items come up even on the Labour benches. I think it was on beer. Somebody was saying this will actually deliver more money, not less, for the Exchequer. So even they recognise dynamic tax strategy. We certainly want to see lower national insurance for employers. I would like to see the employment allowance scheme that we've got today being extended to a much greater extent than we currently have. capital gains tax has to come down. At 28%, we're actually collecting a lot less money than we would do at somewhere between 15 and 20%. And there are a whole series of others, corporation tax too. Again, the examples Canada, Sweden and Germany. The third area, which we haven't heard much from the Chancellor today about, although that may be because we haven't got through the detail of the budget, is on deregulation. The most successful recovery in Europe in the last decade or so was Germany, who took it upon themselves to dramatically deregulate their employment market for small companies. And this is key because small companies are the biggest employment creator in the economy, bar none. And what they did was effectively take out employment law from companies of under about 10 employees and create things like mini-jobs and other mechanisms for reducing the bureaucracy and legislation that surrounds employment. It's massively important. It's one very, very effective way of creating new employment, and it's something we should be undertaking as dramatically as we can. The other item which came up earlier, and I think the member for East Antrim raised it with respect to Northern Ireland alone, was the question of carbon tax and carbon floors. In the next month or so, the changes that are being brought in will give us I think it's a £10 a tonne disadvantage, not against China, not against India, but against Germany and Holland and France. And so we will see transfer of industry, heavy industry, out of this country into Europe. We've seen an exemption coming for ceramics, but frankly there are many, many other industries, about 600,000 employees in the energy-intensive industries, and we need to address that. Indeed, I would propose, the last government was very happy about delivering these golden rules of one sort or another. I would suggest a rule for us on environment and energy policy, and that is we should not introduce any environmental policy that is not matched by our European colleagues. Because if we do that, we would ensure that we didn't do ourselves huge harm. Now let me come to the issue of infrastructure. And the Honourable Member for East Antrim made a perfectly sensible point on broadband. I agree with him. What I would not want to see is massive expenditure for its own sake in the expectation or hope that it will simply generate employment of itself. I'm afraid that's what the Japanese experiment demonstrates does not work. What we want to see is debottlenecking of our railways and our road systems. We want underpinning of things like broadband. I think we need to do more, even though the government can make some good claims in this area. But that is what's going to fundamentally allow growth to take off in Britain and get us back to the 3% level. The last item I want to speak about is bank reform. A number of my colleagues, my right honourable friend for Wokingham, the honourable gentleman, the member for Chichester, the chairman of the Treasury Select Committee, have talked about the issue of bank reform. We have bluntly been too slow. I've got 2 seconds. I'm out.